Right, so we're going to wrap up in Vietnam. So we've lost kind of support for the war at this point. So we're talking about, okay, so how do we successfully end the war? Okay, so Nixon becomes president. Okay, so we're going to see him as president. Where we talk about the release of the Pentagon Papers, and then really kind of through the end of the war. Okay, when Nixon is going to be elected, he kind of runs on this campaign of this idea of peace with honor. Okay, so we realize we've lost public support for the war in Vietnam and we need to back out. But we need to back out in a way that is honorable and that does not leave the South Vietnamese completely defenseless on their own. Okay, Nixon kind of justifies this, kind of appealing to the silent majority. So he says really people still support the Vietnam War and still support being involved, but they're just not saying anything about it. Okay. With Vietnamization, okay, so there's going to be a process. There's a plan for kind of leaving. So first we're going to kind of spend some time kind of pausing the war. We're going to train the South Vietnamese to kind of fight on their own, give them what they need, and then we will begin the process to remove American troops. Okay, so we're going to sign a ceasefire. Okay, again, under this idea of peace with honor. We're going to meet United States, South Vietnam, and North Vietnam. Okay, and basically discuss. We're not being secretive. We're being very kind of clear about our intentions to remove the troops. Okay, so here's going to be our main negotiator, Henry Kissinger. He is going to be the one kind of leading these peace negotiations. He did not want China or Soviet Union involved, again, because of the influence of the Communist Party. Peace negotiations did not go as smoothly as we anticipated. Literally, we are arguing over kind of the size of the conference table that we needed to have at this ceasefire talks. So again, these are kind of long, drawn out, and not very productive. All right, so when we talk about the actual ceasefire, okay, so again, this is kind of like a timeout, a pause of the war. Okay, the conditions that we kind of had to meet and we agreed upon. U.S. has to remove all troops. Okay, we cannot leave any soldiers behind to continue fighting or participating with South Vietnam. Okay, while we take this little time out, the North Vietnamese could leave the troops that were already in South Vietnam. So it's not like they're starting over and restarting the war completely. It's more like, okay, time out, freeze right where you are. Okay, once we remove all the U.S. troops, press play, war is going to resume. Okay, so once we get the U.S. troops out, it's very clear North Vietnam still has the intention of spreading communism to South Vietnam. Number 4, okay, this is the tough one that we have to deal with Vietnam. We make no provisions for our prisoners of war or the people who were missing in action, that we didn't recover the body, we don't know what happened with them. Okay, so under those 4 conditions, we kind of press pause. Okay, we kind of pull up the last troops in March of 73. Okay, 2 years later, North Vietnam is going to defeat South Vietnam. Saigon, which was the kind of the capital of South Vietnam, is going to be renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Clear kind of dictator, totalitarian leader move, renaming the capital after himself. Okay, so this is like while there's that ceasefire, you see a lot of people trying to leave South Vietnam, because we know it's going to fall to communism. Okay, here you see kind of the U.S. officials fleeing the embassy in Vietnam because, again, we know what's going to happen and that South Vietnam is going to have to surrender to North Vietnam. And this is them storming the presidential palace, taking over. Okay, at the end of Vietnam, okay, Vietnam is going to be reunited like our original goal, except for all of Vietnam is going to fall to communism. Okay, when we look at general costs, okay, again, obviously, this more talks about kind of the lasting impact of the Vietnam War, so this would be really good to look at when we talk about long-term impact for your standard chart or something like that. But when we look at the death tolls, Okay, this is very overwhelming for the Vietnamese. Okay, we also see 58,000 Americans are going to be killed, 300,000 are wounded. When we talk about underfunding of Great Society, okay, when we look back at Johnson's presidency, which we talk about a little bit more when we go back and look at his domestic policies, he could either kind of spend money working on poverty and things like that in his domestic program, or he can spend money and focus on the war. The war took precedence. Okay, so all of those great ideas he had with his Great Society program kind of flop. We spent a huge amount of money. Again, think about that blank check. We spent a huge amount of money and resources in fighting in Vietnam, and we're going to be at an all-time low for morale, trust in government, and overall kind of the relationship that we had with our government. Okay, another one. This, guys, even more important than kind of understanding this. These are kind of some legal impacts that come out of the Vietnam War. First of all, it's going to be the 26th Amendment. Okay, this allows the voting age to be able to be pushed back to 18 years old. Okay, this creates the justification. If you're old enough to be drafted, okay, you're old enough to be able to vote. So if you're fighting the war, you should be able to at least vote for the people who are making the policies to do this. Okay. Nixon also is going to abolish the draft and kind of turn to an all-volunteer army. Okay. The next one is going to be the War Powers Act. Okay. This is going to restrict how much power that the president has over the war, and again, kind of reinforce Congress's ability to accept the declaration of war and approve the president's actions. Okay, so a couple things. You had to notify Congress within 48 hours of deploying military forces, and if Congress does not approve, you have to withdraw those forces within 90 days. That's to kind of limit and prevent the dragging on of the war that happened in Vietnam. Okay, so when we think back to like the My Lai massacre, in other events very similar to that, when Vietnam veterans came home, they were not celebrated like World War I vets and World War II vets. A lot of vets were spit on, were called murderers, baby killers, because, again, of that devastating impacts of fighting against the Viet Cong, and a lot of times innocent villagers would kind of get caught in that crossfire of not knowing who our clear enemy was. And then we had no provision, so we still don't know what happened to the prisoners of war or the soldiers who were considered missing in action in Vietnam. Okay, so again, some probably more well-known. Senator John McCain participated in Vietnam War, and he was one of the prisoners of war. So when we talk 2,583 Americans, prisoners of war and missing in action are still unaccounted for. So whether they're still in Vietnam, they died and their bodies were never recovered for. So think about it, that's 2,583 families who don't know what happened to their loved ones. So that also has a devastating impact on how we see the Vietnam War and how that impacted American life. Okay, so again, not something that you need to know, but this is kind of what we learned for Vietnam. Wars have to be much shorter. Okay, it really kind of was just drug on, and people got tired of the fighting, tired of the violence. Obviously, our goal would be that we want to yield few American casualties. We learned it's not smart to record everything that goes on in war. Okay, it is very devastating things that those people saw throughout the war, and it really impacted the way that we supported the war. So it's probably best that the public did not see that. Okay, we need to get support for Congress. When you don't have the public support, you don't have support for the war. Okay, 5 is going to be the most important one. You have to set clear, winnable goals. There was no way to measure if we were winning against fighting an idea. We were fighting against communism. We were fighting against this idea, and there was no way to know if we were winning, if we were making progress. We couldn't pause the war and say, hey, show of hands if you don't want to be communists anymore. Okay, it did not work that way. Okay, and we definitely wanted to set a deadline for troop withdrawals. So no more blank check idea, no more send unlimited troops for unlimited amount of time. We needed to basically have clear steps all the way through. If you've never been, obviously wait till we are not in a quarantine situation anymore. But definitely check out the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. This is from an aerial view. And this starts at the beginning of the war down here. And this has a list of all of the people who died in the Vietnam War. And that also includes the close to 3,000 prisoners of war and missing in action. Okay, so if you go here, it's the list of names. So you see kind of the peak at the middle of the war and then close down here towards the end of the war. Other memorials to the nurses in Vietnam. Okay, so once Vietnam falls to communism, we do not recognize them as a country, and we do not do so until President Clinton recognized them in 1995. Again, you see other predominant political figures you see kind of fighting in Vietnam. Okay, so remember, this is still part of the Cold War that we talked about, but this is going to be fighting kind of that idea of a proxy war. So we're not fighting directly against communism, but we're still fighting kind of those ideologies of communism.